All right, let's jump right in. Welcome to today's Explainer. Today, we're literally stepping back in time to reconstruct the authentic, historical, and scientific context of one of the most famous meals in human history, the Last Supper.
Absolutely. And our main goal here is to help all of you, our brothers and sisters tuning in, really grasp the true cultural context of this moment. It's so easy to accidentally just read our modern culture right into the biblical narrative. But today we are zooming in on the cup sitting right in the center of that table to figure out what was actually inside it, which really helps us understand the setting and exactly what Jesus was saying.
So, here's a big question for everyone watching right now. When you picture that famous scene, what do you actually see in the cup? Is it pure, pristine, completely unfermented grape juice? Or is it something else entirely?
It's such a great question to start with because, so many of us are heavily influenced by modern traditions, right? We just naturally assume it was standard grape juice. But as you'll see, that visual assumption doesn't actually match the historical reality of first century Judea at all.
The ancient reality was totally different. That first century cup was muddy, it was earthy, heavily textured, and, well, perfectly imperfect. It was a completely different sensory experience than we're used to. Wow, that is such a stark contrast to our modern expectations. Today we expect our juices to be completely pure, visually transparent, and just totally unblemished. Well, to understand why, let's look at the agricultural calendar gap. The Israeli grape harvest happens in the autumn, but the Last Supper took place during Passover, which is all the way in the spring. That is a massive 6-month gap.
Oh, right. And obviously, without modern refrigeration or freezing tech or chemical preservatives, pure grape juice simply could not survive that 6-month stretch without either spoiling or fermenting. It's just scientifically impossible.
Exactly. And that's because of the unstoppable wild yeast process. The second a grape is harvested and crushed in that warm, arid climate of Jerusalem, the wild yeast that naturally lives right there on the grape skins gets straight to work. It kicks off an automatic rapid fermentation process within a matter of hours. There was literally no way to stop it. Okay, so it was definitely wine, but how strong was it exactly?
Well, to put it into perspective, today's modern wines use artificially cultivated yeast to reach much higher alcohol levels, usually around 14 to 16%. But in the first century, wild yeast was actually pretty fragile. Once the natural alcohol content hit about 10 or 11%, that wild yeast would just naturally die off, capping the strength right there.
So I'm guessing you couldn't just walk into a first century tavern and order a high-proof whiskey or brandy then.
Oh, not at all. The actual technology of distillation wasn't even invented by humanity until the 8th century, which is well into the Middle Ages. High-proof hard liquor physically did not exist yet.
But here is the massive cultural shocker. In Greco-Roman and Jewish societies, drinking that pure, undiluted wine was considered the habit of barbarians and drunkards.
Curious host? Wait, really? No way. So even though their wine was naturally lower in alcohol to begin with, drinking it straight was just a massive social faux pas?
Completely. To be civilized meant you always diluted your wine. In fact, the absolute golden ratio for daily drinking and religious festivals like Passover was 3-to-1.
So they would literally take 3 parts of water and mix it with just 1 part of their concentrated, naturally fermented wine.
You hit the nail on the head. That was the standard. And when you take a wine that's naturally around 10% alcohol and you dilute it 3-to-1 with water, the actual consumption alcohol level plummets. It drops all the way down to a mostly harmless 2-to-3%. Okay, so drinking a first century cup of diluted wine was essentially comparable to drinking a modern light beer. Unless you literally went out of your way to drink an enormous amount, it was actually quite hard to get drunk. But why go through all that trouble to dilute it if it was already relatively weak?
Honestly, pure survival. Ancient, raw water was notoriously dangerous. It was often teeming with deadly bacteria that caused horrific diseases like cholera. So the trace amounts of alcohol, combined with pine resins mixed into the wine, actually acted as a purifying agent. Dilution wasn't just good etiquette. It was a completely necessary safe water strategy just for daily hydration.
Section 1. Tasting the Last Supper, a sensory reality. So because ancient wine was unfiltered and heavily oxidized, the pure wine would have been this really dark, muddy, earthy Marsala red.
Oh, okay. But since they diluted it 3 to 1 with water, that muddy Marsala red would naturally transform into more of a brownish pink hue, right? Visually, it would probably look like a low saturation, faded rose.
What about the texture, though? Was it thin and watery because of all that dilution?
Actually, no, not at all. First century winemakers very often used sun-dried grapes to concentrate the sugars, which made the raw wine incredibly high in pectin. It was very sweet, quite thick, and deeply raisin-like in flavor. It actually shared a lot of characteristics with a modern Italian Amarone.
And the flavor profile gets even wilder when you look at how they had to preserve it over that 6-month gap without our modern sealed glass bottles. They heavily relied on herbaceous tree resins and spices. We're talking things like pine resin, myrrh, frankincense, cinnamon, and honey mixed directly into the wine. Wait a minute, if you combine thick resin sweetness, heavy oxidation, pine resin, myrrh, and cinnamon, it wouldn't have tasted anything like thin grape juice. It tasted exactly like winter mulled wine.
Exactly. That communion cup tasted and smelled heavily of spice and resin. It was a full sensory experience.
Resident Historian, Section 2. Bringing the receipts. Proof from the dust. And we know this for sure because modern interdisciplinary scientists have used advanced gas chromatography mass spectroscopy on actual first-century clay pots found right in the Galilee region. They detected strong chemical signals for tartaric acid, proving it was indeed fermented wine, along with heavy traces of pine resin, which confirms the use of natural tree sap as a preservative.
Wow. So this isn't just some historical guesswork. This is hard, peer-reviewed science pulled right out of the dirt.
Yep, and we even have some breaking news on this front from January 2024. A study published in the Cambridge journal Antiquity explored what they call the Dahlia effect. It confirmed that first-century winemakers widely fermented their grapes in dolia, which are these massive clay pots buried halfway into the ground. That's amazing! The porous clay allowed for micro-oxygenation, which scientifically aligns perfectly with that muddy, heavily oxidized Marsala color profile we were just talking about. Resident Historian, the literature from the era backs this up perfectly too. The Mishnah, which is the authoritative 2nd century Jewish legal text, explicitly states that the holy Passover meal, the exact meal Jesus was eating, legally required a mixture of 3 parts water to 1 part wine to be considered clean and pure. And it looks like the secular world of the time was in total agreement with that. The famous Roman scholar Pliny the Elder noted in his encyclopedic work that drinking pure, undiluted wine was a massive breach of etiquette. He literally called it a demonstration of a severe lack of self-control. Even linguistically, the Greek word used in the New Testament for wine, oinos, always referred to a fermented alcoholic beverage in that specific cultural context.
Right! And when Jesus blesses the cup and calls it the fruit of the vine, he isn't talking about fresh juice. That was a fixed, well-known Jewish religious idiom used specifically to bless wine at the Passover meal.
You know, if the ancient history is this absolutely clear, I'm in utter disbelief that the modern tradition of drinking pristine, unfermented juice during communion didn't even exist until the year 1869. No way! It's true. It all traces back to Dr. Thomas Welch. In 1869, he utilized brand new pasteurization technology to create the first commercial unfermented grape juice, specifically to support the temperance and prohibition movements in the United States.
It's just crazy how easily we can accidentally project a 19th century American invention backwards into a first century Middle Eastern text over the generation.
So, that leaves us with a really profound final thought. Does embracing this muddy, earthy history ruin the story for us?
I don't think so at all. For all our brothers and sisters watching, understanding the messy, heavily spiced, diluted reality of first-century Judea powerfully roots the covenant of the Last Supper right in the middle of real, gritty, authentic human history. It wasn't pristine and manufactured, it was deeply human. And understanding that cultural background just brings these biblical texts to life.
I absolutely agree. It helps us not read our modern culture into the Bible, but rather understand the true narrative and the depth of Jesus' words. Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer. We really hope this leaves you with a fresh perspective and a desire to keep exploring the history behind the word.